Hey guys, welcome to the second part of the clutch change. Today I'm going to be dropping the exhaust and sliding the torque tube back so we can get in there and change the clutch. So let's get started. Alright guys, here are all the tools you're going to need. I've even brought out a few spare parts because it's going to be dark, it's going to be cramped, and I want you to be able to see clearly where everything is located. Now at the moment I'm not going to be going through and showing you these bolts in any particular order. I just want to show you the tools you'll need and where the bolts are located. The first tool you're going to need is a 6mm hex key, and that is for removing the bolts in the pressure plate and the two bolts holding the speed and reference sensor bracket to the block. Next you'll need an 8mm socket, and that is for removing just one small nut on the back of the starter. Then you'll need a 10mm socket, and that is for removing this nut that clamps two wires from the starter to the back of the bell housing. And it also removes the clutch fork pin retaining bolt here. I'm going to put all that on the screen now. And if you have a late 944 turbo with a two-piece crossover, you're going to need a 10mm wrench to hold the nuts. Next you'll need a 13mm socket and a 13mm wrench. These remove a host of things on the car, and you will need a wrench for removing the bolts at the header. And as far as the bell housing goes, you'll need the 13mm socket to remove the clutch slave cylinder bolts that are here next to the starter, and the nut or bolt that you have here that hold the ground wires to the top of the bell housing. Then you'll need a 17mm socket or a 17mm wrench, and that is for removing the torque tube bolts located here and bolts that hold a shield onto the bottom of the bell housing located here and here. Then to remove the starter bolts and the bolts that hold the bell housing to the block, you'll need a 19mm socket or a 19mm wrench. And starter bolts are located here, and the other one comes up from this direction like that. And then you have the 4 bolts that attach the bell housing to the block, and they are located here, 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 and here. So the next tools you're going to need are a universal joint and a really long extension. Also make sure that you have a short 19mm since a deep well won't work. And finally, to remove the clutch fork pin, you're going to need a fairly long M8125 bolt and a pair of vice grips. Guys, before I get started, I thought I'd show you around in our car a little bit. You can see our transmission mount still hanging there. And as I mentioned in the other video, you can just go ahead and remove the bolts on each side of this member here, and you can drop the mount with the transmission. However, you got to move all these fuel lines out of the way, and that's why I personally don't like doing it that way, so I just leave the mount in the car. And here we have our torque tube, and you can see it's sitting on our torsion bar carrier because the transmission is no longer holding it up. And this car has the later plastic tank, and they have a cover over their fuel pump. So yeah, I thought I would just show you around a little bit. This car has Coney shocks and Coney struts in the front. Now moving on to the exhaust, I'm thinking that I'm going to try and drop it in one piece. I was thinking about separating it here, but some of the rubber on these hangers is already missing, so I might be able to cheat and make this job a little bit easier by removing it one piece. So alright guys, I thought I'd give you a look up underneath an early car for good measure. I already had the transaxle and the exhaust out of this car, so I thought I'd give you a look around. Now, the first thing you may notice is that this isn't removable like it is in the later cars. And you can see there's no provisions for the late mount. This is where the early mounts bolt in with their 17mm bolts on each side of the transmission. This here is the bottom of the steel fuel tank. Notice that there aren't any heat shields here. And I'll come back a little bit, give you a better view of the steel tank. So now that we've had a look underneath the cars and we've seen some of the differences, the first thing you want to do when unhooking the exhaust is either remove or unplug the oxygen sensor. Alright, so while I do have this O2 sensor remover, I've just decided to unplug it up here and leave the sensor on the exhaust for now. So the next thing you want to do is check to see if your exhaust has a sniffer and unhook it. You can see that this is an early car and it doesn't even have provisions for the sniffer. This mount here is from a late car, and you can see where it's connected here with this M6 bolt. So if you do have a sniffer, you will find it down here with a blue cap held in by a 10mm bolt. So now I'm up underneath the front of the car and I'm going to be removing these 6 bolts from the header. And once they're removed, I'll be able to drop the exhaust. They are 13mm bolts, so you'll need a 13mm wrench and a 13mm socket. So alright guys, I got the bolts removed up here at the header. Now I just need to remove that hanger right there near the catalytic converter and remove the nuts that hold the muffler on, and this should all come out. So as I mentioned before, there are 2 nuts on each side of the muffler here, and I'm going to go ahead and remove those. And once you remove them, the muffler can be dropped out of the way, and then I'll remove that hanger up there. And there you go. So once I removed the nuts here, I was able to push the exhaust off, and it came right off that rubber hanger up there. So with it unplugged, I'm able to just pull it all out, and it's that easy. So here are a few exhausts. No matter which exhaust you are removing, I will tell you how to do it. You can see here that this one has the sniffer. So it is from a late car. You want to use care when removing it so you don't tear it up or tear something else up. This is removed with a 17mm wrench if you would prefer to do that. Here you can see the exhaust that I pulled out of this car. It is from an earlier car that does not have the sniffer. This car has an aftermarket catalytic because the catalytic should look like that and that. Here we have the turbo exhaust on the left side, and of course this is the NA exhaust. Both of these measure about 9 inches across. 88 exhausts measure 12 inches across and have a resonator right here. As you can see, the exhaust hangers are in the same location. This pipe here is for the wastegate, and it also has a catalytic of its own. Rather than running to the passenger side or right side of the car, the turbo exhausts turn and go up the left side of the car where the turbo is located. If you have an early 944 turbo with a single piece crossover, you will also need to remove these 6 bolts at the header. The single piece crossover will also need to be unbolted at the turbo. There are 4 8mm hex key bolts. One is facing the opposite direction. This turbo has a 2-piece crossover, so it does not need to be removed. However, you do have to remove the 3 M6 bolts that require a 10mm wrench and a 10mm socket. On a turbo, to unbolt the exhaust, you need to remove the 3 17mm nuts on the bottom of the downpipe. You will need a 17mm socket, a universal joint, and a very long extension. So alright guys, now that I have the exhaust dropped, I'm ready to start pulling the torque tube back out of the way. And in order to do that, I need to remove this shift lever here. And here you can see that there's a 13mm bolt here in front of it and a 13mm bolt in behind it. So once you have the bolts removed, you're ready to remove the shifter, and it should just pull right up out of the foam, and there you go. Alright guys, now that I got the shift lever out of the car, I'm going to go ahead and pull this shift rod out. Now you may have to turn it a little bit here and there, but it should pull straight out like that, and there you go. Alright guys, once we get the exhaust out of the way, we're ready to loosen the exhaust hangers, because we need to be able to rotate the torque tube here 180 degrees, and these will be in our way. Now you don't have to remove them completely, you just need to loosen them up, and you'll need a 13mm ratchet for that. So alright guys, first I need to remove the starter here before I can get to the bolts and slide the torque tube back. So you'll need an 8mm for this bolt and a 13 for this. These are positive wires and they will arc, so make sure that you have performed step 1 and disconnected the battery first. So alright, here are the bolts for the starter, and this bolt is going to actually come up through there like this and be connected, so you'll find the head on the back side of the starter while this one's on the front side. So alright guys, I've got the starter off, and now you can see the 4 17mm bolts that hold the torque tube on. So here are the 4 17mm torque tube bolts that you'll be removing. Alright guys, I got all 4 bolts out of the torque tube, and I'm ready to slide it back out of the way now. Once you've removed the bolts and the bell housing, you want to come to the rear and lift up on the torque tube and turn it 180 degrees upside down. You can see now that this was at the top of the transmission, and now it's completely down, and then you pull it all the way up until it hits this cross member. Now you can remove this cross member in later cars and get a little bit more clearance. However, remember that on early cars this isn't removable. Now you can see my torque tube is slid back out of the way. Alright guys, I have to remove the reference sensors down here, and I want to show you how I'm going to do it. If you can see down there, you can see that I have my hex key in the bolt. Now what I did was I came up to the top and I worked my hands down in there and inserted the hex key into the bolt, and it has a universal joint on it and a very long extension that reaches way down in there. So here's my extension hanging down from the reference sensor bolt. So alright guys, as you can see here, that worked as planned. 6mm hex key with a universal joint and a really long extension. You saw how far it hung down, and it came out without any fight whatsoever. And now I just have to do the other side. So alright guys, let me give you an idea of what I did here. I ran my arm between the brake booster here and the oil fill neck, and just below it a little bit, to run my arm back in and get behind the reference sensor. You can see my hand here, and I have the socket inserted into the bolt. Now, if you keep wiggling it around, it'll go deep into the bolt there, and it shouldn't fall out as you get underneath the car. So there you go. There's the second bolt from my speed and reference sensor bracket. Here's a closer look at the speed and reference sensor brackets. This one here is from an early car. This one here with the shield is from a later one. Now, if you have an early car, you will see that the reference sensors go into these holes on the bell housing, and there is a bolt that goes into the engine at the top here and one that goes into the bottom. Now, there is a locating pin on this hole here, so once you remove the bolts, you will only be able to move it like that. Now, on an early car, you can just remove the sensors, then slide it forward off the pin and remove the bracket like that. However, on later cars, this shield is not removable. So you cannot, even if you remove the sensors, slide it off that pin. So the best way to do this, I found, is to have this loose enough where it's about to come off the pin, remove the bolts in the bell housing, and as you start pulling the bell housing back, it will slide off that pin and you'll be able to remove it that way. So alright, now that I have the speed and reference sensors out of the way, I'm going to remove the two bolts here on the clutch slave cylinder and get it up out of my way. Once you have the clutch slave out of the way, you want to go ahead and remove this 10mm nut here. It's holding the starter wires to the bell housing and must be removed. So, alright, on each side of your bell housing you're going to see two 17mm bolts. I'm not sure what happened to mine here, but I need to remove this one, and there'll be two here on the other side that I'll need to remove. So here's a better look at the four 17mm bolts that are holding in the shield that is located at the bottom of the bell housing. All you need to do is remove these four bolts and the shield comes right out. There you go. Once you remove the bolts, the shield comes straight out. Alright guys, this is the clutch fork pin, and this bolt here holds it in. So I need to remove this bolt. It's a 10mm bolt, and then I'll be able to remove the clutch fork pin here. So once you have removed the retaining bolt here, you're ready to remove the clutch fork pin, and to do that you'll need an M8 125 bolt, and you'll just thread it up into this. So alright, as you can see, as I'm turning it, I'm pulling down and it's pulling the clutch fork pin out with it. Alternatively, you can take a pair of vice grips and put them on the bolt and then just rock it as you pull it down, and then there's your clutch fork pin. So the reason why you have to remove the clutch fork pin is because if you've never seen the inside of this before, you may be tempted to unbolt the bell housing and start pulling. However, the clutch fork, since it's a pull type clutch, is holding on to the throwout bearing here on the pressure plate. So as you're trying to remove the bell housing, all you're doing is pulling on the throwout bearing here, which is still attached to the engine. Alright, once you have your clutch fork pin removed, you're ready to start removing the four bolts on your bell housing. So once again, here are the four 19mm bolts that hold the bell housing on. Alright, I'm able to reach all the bolts on the bell housing by using a short 19mm socket, a universal joint, and a really long extension. Right now I am removing a bolt at the very top of the bell housing using this method, and it's working just fine. Now I need to remove this bolt over here, if you can see it, right there, and it's got some ground wires on it and I need to remove it. So up at the top of the bell housing is a place where a bunch of ground wires connect to the bell housing. Now, in some cases you may need to have the bell housing completely unbolted and start sliding it back before you can see this nut or bolt, because there are a lot of things in the way. This is off a late car here and it has a 13mm nut. However, the car I'm working on has a 13mm bolt there. But I just wanted to let you know, because if you start pulling on these you can damage the wires and you're not going to be able to remove the bell housing without removing these wires. Now that I have that bolt removed, the wires are now free and I can now remove the bell housing. So alright guys, I just got the bell housing off. Now I just need to remove these hex head bolts going around the pressure plate here, and that's done with a 6mm hex key. Alright, I just got the pressure plate off, and as you can see the flywheel looks pretty glazed up, so I guess I'll be taking it off and having it resurfaced. I will be sliding out from under the car here and showing you the clutch disc. So here's the clutch, and as you can see, it doesn't spin with it. It is split right along that line there, and even the tabs are completely worn, so as I spin it, you can see it just passes right over. Alright guys, here's a better look at the clutch in daylight. You can see that it ripped right along that seam there, and there are a few chunks missing from the rubber, and you can just turn it freely. The tabs are so wore down that they don't catch, so that's going to go in the garbage. Over here I already have my new clutch, and I will be doing a special video on that. The next video in this series will be me putting everything back together. So alright guys, that's going to do it for this episode. Next time I'm going to be pulling the pilot bearing and having the flywheel resurfaced. There are a few other things that I plan to do with this project, so you'll just have to stay tuned. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.